For my first geopolitical video, I want to focus on the topic centered around the question of why did the US and Russia split up Korea instead of Japan? It's been about 2 years since I've uploaded a video on YouTube. Life has been busy with 5 kids and 3 businesses. I did a video back in 2021 on the top 100 Korean-speaking foreigners that took me so much time to research, literally about 6 months, and I think that kind of burned me out a little. Also, as I've gotten older, I think my taste and preferences on the type of content that I'm interested in has shifted some. Recently, the types of videos that I find myself watching the most have to do with geopolitics on channels like Peter Zion, What If Altus, The Infographics Show, Graham Hancock, History Matters, and other similar sites. Likewise, I'm enjoying some of the storytelling from channels like Side Projects and Thoughty2. So I wanted to try to do my first video on something related to geopolitics instead of Korean culture reaction videos with my family, live stream debates, or my weird Korean rap videos. I'm planning on doing this video in Korean and English. I have a lot of viewers that aren't Korean who still watch my Korean videos, and I'm also able to put more feeling behind my words in English than Korean. So I'll record it once in English and then again in Korean. For me, one of the major reasons that I have this Korean YouTube channel is to push myself to continue to study the Korean language and try to connect with Koreans and other Korean speakers, as there are very few people for me to speak with in Korean where I live here in Utah. And the only way for me to get better at discussing issues related to geopolitics, economics, business, etc., is to dive into topics that are related to those issues and learn more about them in general. For my first geopolitical video, I want to focus on the topic centered around the question of why did the US and Russia split up Korea instead of Japan? I'll preface this by saying that I'm not a history major and I'm also not Korean, so my viewpoints may have a lot of holes in them and my perspectives may differ a lot from your own, as I'm obviously a Korean-speaking American. To be honest, my opinions differ a lot from the general population here in the US as well, since America tends to be either Republican with a narrow America First viewpoint lacking very little understanding of world history, or Democrats with a progressive, sometimes socialist agenda pushing morals that I oftentimes do not agree with. Also, my grandfather was a pilot, served as a commander in the US Navy, and fought in the Korean War. So even before I lived in Korea as a teenager from 1999 to 2001, Korea has held a special place in my heart. In order to dive into this topic of how and why Korea ended up being divided between North and South, and now having the most heavily militarized border in the world, I think it's important to go back to the time period between around 1895 to 1910, when Korea was still united, and look at the possible outcomes that could have occurred in Korea. So much of the fate of Korea came down to Japan. After Japan defeated China during the Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895, Korea was no longer under the protection or tributary obligation that it used to have with China as a background to help protect them from a Japanese invasion. Also, Japan soon defeated Russia in what I will call World War Zero and the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. During this brief 1895 to 1910 period, Korea moved from this 500 plus year long Joseon dynasty period that had lasted since 1392 as a vassal state to the Qing dynasty to proclaiming itself the Korean Empire from 1897 to 1910. This to me was the most crucial moment for Korea to control its own destiny. What's baffling to me as a non-Korean outsider is how the Korean Empire just gave up and capitulated to Japan without any type of a fight. Japan just kind of snuck in there like a Trojan horse with shiny westernized weapons and military doctrine and tricked Korea into allowing it to help westernize their military force in exchange for protection. This was a bad move, and ultimately it was no one's fault except for Korea, primarily Emperor Gojong, by signing the Treaty of Gwanghwa in 1876, paving the way for Japan's annexation of Korea. I could totally be wrong on this, but I feel like some of Korea's stronger leaders like Sejong, Lee Sun-shin, Taejong, etc. could have done much better. I'll talk about this in a second, but from 1904 to 1905, Korea had a chance to remain independent had they been able to align themselves with Great Britain. This was perhaps the biggest missed opportunity of the whole Korean Peninsula debacle, even greater than the mistakes made by General MacArthur, which I'll bring up shortly. I know that Ko Jong's wife, Myeongsung Hwaemin-si, was eventually assassinated by the Japanese, so I feel kind of bad saying this, but I don't think that the tax system she instituted helped earn her much public trust in the eyes of her people. And all of the famine, poverty, crushing taxes, and corruption among the ruling class led Ko Jong to plead with China and Japan to help crush the peasant revolts, which is not a great look for outsiders like Japan to see. You know things are bad when you're asking foreign countries to help attack and defeat your own people. And I don't think that Ko Jong aligning himself with Russia after his wife was killed and signing the 1884 Russia-Korea Treaty was super helpful either. And by the time he was facing an internal exile to the Russian legation in Seoul in 1896, it just seemed like his days were numbered. In a way, it kind of reminds me of how the US exiled Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii in 1891, just 5 years before, eventually forcing Hawaii to become a part of the US. In retrospect, I think that it was Ko Jong who really opened up the door for Russia's involvement in Korea, which we are still dealing with today via North Korea. Had Ko Jong aligned himself with Great Britain prior to the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which was signed in 1902, rather than Russia, Korea would have been in a much better situation today. Once the Anglo-Japanese alliance was signed between Britain and Japan, it was pretty much game over for Taiwan, Korea, and Manchuria. And to some extent, this carried over to even the Philippines and Indonesia. It's kind of sad for Ko Jong because he first sought help from the Qing in China, and they were defeated by Japan. Then he aligned himself with Russia, and Japan defeated Russia. Then in 1904 to 1905, he sent Lee Han-eung to Great Britain to gain support for Korea to remain independent, but Britain ignored his request since they had already aligned with Japan, causing Lee Han-eung to commit suicide in protest. This effort by Ko Jong to try and work a deal directly with Britain after Japan was already in bed with Britain was the straw that broke the camel's back, pushing Japan over the edge to attack and annex Korea. Japan felt like Korea was trying to date their new girlfriend, Great Britain, and retaliated in response. It's my personal opinion that had Britain helped Korea right here when Ko Jong sent Lee Han-eung as an emissary, all of this could have been avoided. The Brits could have told Japan to back off, and it would have been protected much like Hong Kong or Singapore, but Ko Jong really needed to get this done with Britain prior to 1902 to make this happen. So outside of aligning themselves earlier on with the Brits, what were the other possible outcomes for Korea starting around this Korean Empire time period? I think the first option is that Korea could have gone to war with Japan. They probably would have lost, but at least they could have put up a fight and not capitulated all of its land so easily. I also obviously partially blame Britain as well, since even though Britain didn't join the Russo-Japanese War, it helped support Japan in espionage, ship design, finance, and diplomacy during the war. It was a similar situation to how NATO is helping Ukraine fight against Russia today. In some ways, I get it because Russia is always a threat, and anything that the West can do to limit Russia's expansionism that has reached as far as the Baltic Sea in the west to the US continent via Alaska in the east has typically made sense for the West. And Britain's primary concern at the time was trying to block George V of Germany and his cousin Nicholas II of Russia from teaming up and conquering the entirety of Eurasia. But by Britain supporting Japan, it basically meant that no other Western country, including France or the United States, could or would come to the aid of Korea against Japan between 1895 and 1910. Had the United States and Russia not entered World War II and defeated Japan, I think that most Koreans would be speaking Japanese today. I lived in Haenam when I was 20 years old, and the older generation told me story after story about Japanese brutality, comfort women, and being forced to speak Japanese, which many of them reluctantly still knew very well to this day. To me, Japan owning and occupying Korea today is the number one worst possible outcome that could have happened for Korea. I would rather have the divided North and South Korea that we have today while maintaining the language and identity of the Korean people with a chance for future reunification than have Korea wiped out completely and re-indoctrinated as Japanese citizens. The second possible outcome was that Korea could have snuggled up closer to China instead of Japan. In this scenario, eventually the entire Korean peninsula would have become communist like North Korea or Vietnam under the influence of the CCP. Most likely, the Kim family in North Korea would have complete control over all of the Korean peninsula today, which I personally do not see as an ideal outcome either. It's better than having complete Japanese rule, but it would still have been a horribly awful situation that I'm glad was avoided. This brings us to other potential outcomes. Are there any scenarios between 1945 to 1950 in which Korea would not end up divided between Russia and the US? I believe there were two chances for this to occur. The first chance was in 1945 at the Potsdam Conference between the US, Britain, China, and Russia. Under this proposed occupation plan, Japan would have been divided instead of Korea. Kanto and Kansai would have gone to the US. Hokkaido and Tohoku would have gone to Russia. Kyushu and Chogoku would have gone to the UK, and Shigoku would have gone to China. Tokyo would have been split up 4 ways like Berlin. This is where Korea became the sacrificial lamb so that Japan could keep its traditional island territories. I was always taught here in the US that Japan capitulated and ended the war because we dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While there is some truth to this, the bigger concern that Japan was facing was Russians declaring its entrance into the war. According to Japanese-American professor Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, the Soviets' entrance into the war was more decisive than the American atomic bomb. Hasegawa said that the Japanese surrendered to the US to protect the imperial system and to avoid a Soviet-involved partition of Japan. The Soviets began their offensive on August 9, 1945, and immediately struck Manchuria and the southern half of Sakhalin Island, seizing Ungi and the North Hamgyong province in a single day. The very next day, on August 10th, Japan communicated its intention to surrender. That evening, Colonel Dean Rusk, the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, proposed having the 38th parallel separate the two spheres of control on the Korean peninsula. On August 15th, the Japanese emperor officially announced an end to the war. Fast forward to today, had Japan been split up instead of Korea, chances are that Japan would have eventually been reunified, similar to what happened in Germany following the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, this may not have been the case, and it may also have given Russia and perhaps China more freedom to move beyond the first island chain that currently keeps both Russia and China at bay, without being able to freely roam the Pacific Ocean outside of their submarines. You can also blame the US here, because President Truman pushed very hard to make sure that the United States got all of Japan, since he felt like they were the ones who had put forth all the effort in defeating the Japanese. He refused to give any land to France and allowed them to regain their own colonized islands in Asia instead, the UK, China, or Russia. The second chance was in 1950 with General Douglas MacArthur, who led the UN combat forces from 22 nations, of which the US provided 50% of the ground forces, 86% of the naval forces, and 93% of the air power. On September 11, 1950, President Truman issued orders to advance beyond the 38th parallel into North Korea. This order was ratified on October 4th with Resolution 376V, which authorized MacArthur and UN forces to cross the 38th parallel and to unify all of Korea under the Republic of Korea. So the UN officially authorized MacArthur to reunify Korea, making this a real opportunity for Korea to become one nation again. This is where MacArthur, in my opinion, really screwed things up. While it is true that China had already sent 69,200 soldiers to fight in Korea by June of 1950, which included the 156th, the 164th, and 166th divisions, and made up 47% of North Korea's 148,680-man army, these former Chinese soldiers were of Korean ethnicity, meaning this was not a direct intervention by the Chinese. As a side note, does anyone know how all these Koreans ended up in China in the first place? I've studied the history of the Goryeo-ins, starting with how 13 families from Hamgyongdo went across the Tumen River to Yeonju in Russia, but I don't know much at all about the Koreans living in China other than the whole Pade group that goes way back to the Goguryeo days. The Chinese were showing restraint, much like how we in the US are showing restraint today and not sending US troops to Ukraine, and Russia is showing restraint by not attacking Poland, Germany, or other NATO countries that are helping Ukraine fight Russia. China was also showing much restraint by yielding air superiority to the UN forces in Korea rather than bombing across enemy lines. George Marshall, the Secretary of Defense and five-star general, stated in a US congressional hearing that we can move reserves with practically no restriction at all in Korea, and they have the greatest difficulty in relation to that. If bombing starts, we will have a great many conditions that will be far less advantageous to us. Joe Collins, the Army Chief of Staff, explained how communist restraint had prevented another American debacle. Referring to the moment MacArthur had initially sought permission to bomb into China, Collins said, "When the first recommendations came in to bomb across the frontier, our troops were separated in Korea. The 10th Corps was operating from the base at Hungnam, and our other forces were operating from bases at Busan and Incheon. As soon as the Chinese attack began, we were very much concerned about the fact that we would have to get that 10th Corps out, and had we permitted the bombing north of the Yalu, we were dreadfully afraid that that might be the thing that would release the Russian planes, and additionally have them give additional assistance to the Chinese, and might well have subjected the 10th Corps to the bombardment and possibly submarine attack during the perilous evacuation from Hungnam. Troops evacuating from a port of that character and commercial ships are terribly subject to air and underwater attack, and in my judgment it would have been a much too risky procedure." Collins wasn't quite so blunt as to say it, but his message was clear. Far from complaining about the limited nature of the war, MacArthur should have been grateful for it. It was General MacArthur's public statements about wanting to not only bomb behind enemy lines at the Yalu River and supporting the KMT against the CCP that caused the Chinese to send 180,000 Chinese forces and push UN troops back to the 38th parallel. Had MacArthur not threatened and pushed to be involved in the Chinese Civil War, Korea would possibly still be united today. MacArthur's lack of diplomacy and statesmanship, along with his overconfidence of being able to take a war into China with Russia right there, is what triggered China to attack and push UN troops back down to the 38th parallel. To MacArthur's point, supporting the KMT against the CCP would have been the right thing to do given where our world is today. But lobbying for this is what triggered the Chinese to attack and take North Korea back. The US either needed to go all in and do as MacArthur said to defeat the CCP, which would potentially have saved us a lot of trouble with Taiwan and the CCP today, or he should not have provoked the CCP to the point that they counterattacked in Korea. But making public statements about the need to attack the CCP and bring the war to China while not being in a position to actually execute on that threat is what ultimately led to the demise of Korea being split in half. In so many ways, we can blame MacArthur directly for both the positives of South Korea existing today and the negatives of North Korea existing, essentially as a vassal buffer state and guard dog for China with additional support by Russia. So what are my predictions for the future? Will North and South Korea ever be reunited? High level, I do think that it will eventually happen, although I'm not certain of the exact specifics of how it will occur. Both North and South Koreans want reunification, much like how China and Taiwan have their one China policy. Both the Koreans and the Chinese just disagree about whose one Korea or one China it should be. One key difference between the Korean War and today's world is that South Korea is much, much stronger than it used to be and much more capable of an attack. And if South Korea defeats North Korea, the new reunified Korea will become a nuclear superpower, similar to France's power projection in Europe and abroad. I just don't see a scenario in which North Korea wins against South Korea and conquers it unless the United States falls apart. Even if North Korea uses all of its nuclear weapons, which would be catastrophic but still possible. Currently, South Korea is ranked number 6 in global military strength behind the US, Russia, China, India, and the UK. North Korea is ranked number 34 but also has around 40 nuclear bombs. A combined Korea would probably move it into a top 5 global superpower. For Korea to be reunited, I think it would have to happen with a weakened China. Russia is already weakened from the war in Ukraine, and without their nukes, they have proven to be a paper tiger on the battlefield, retreating behind winter weather to protect them and using World War II authoritarian top-down military doctrine that just doesn't work. It reminds me of how Britain tried fighting American Indians in straight lines while the American Indians used guerrilla fighting tactics to defeat them. Russia's tanks are nearly worthless against drones and javelin rockets, and Russia hasn't proven capable of modern air superiority either. All of this should send a huge message to China and North Korea, who either copied or purchased Soviet-style weapons. China only has about a 10-year window before their population declines due to their one-child policy. Having only 1.28 births per woman is a catastrophic death trap that is well under the 2.1 rate needed just to maintain a stable population. This demographic nightmare would seriously hamper their abilities to expand via land grab if they take longer than 10 years to do so, and during this time the US will have replenished its Pacific naval fleet sufficiently to withstand a Chinese attack. If China attacks Taiwan and loses, or suffers heavy losses, there may be a window that will open up for Korean reunification. Also, if the CCP falls apart again, China will probably revert back to a warlord era similar to what it faced from 1916 to 1928, during which time Tibet will likely break off and become its own country again. India will probably attack China for control of limited water resources, much like the conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia, and North Korea will be vulnerable to a US led coalition attack, along with South Korea, to reunify the country. Unfortunately, if I was in charge of the CCP, I would probably give Kim Jong un a ring on the phone and tell him to attack South Korea at the same time that China attacks Taiwan in order to cause maximum confusion for a US led Pacific coalition. This, of course, is if China decides to attack Taiwan within the next 10 years before its population falls apart. If China fails and North Korea attacks the South and fails, there may be a window of opportunity there to retake North Korea under heavy losses. Also, if Russia has a coup and breaks up into 7 plus smaller countries, there is a chance that China could attack Siberia and Mongolia. This could bring about a conflict between China and Russia that might sufficiently weaken China to the point that either South Korea can defeat North Korea and or the KMT is able to resume its civil war and defeat the CCP, bringing China's One China policy under KMT rule as General MacArthur had pushed for. Interestingly enough, if there is another war on the Korean Peninsula, it's likely that Japan ends up helping the US, the UK, Australia, and other NATO forces to defeat the Kim regime, which would be an ironic full circle conclusion to the reunification of Korea. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts on what I've had to say. Obviously, I'm coming from the background of a random American guy who speaks a little bit of Korean, and I don't have a degree in political science or anything like that. If there's a geopolitical topic that you would like for me to cover, let me know what it is in the comments below. Also, please make sure to like this video and subscribe if you think I should do more videos like this. Thank you very much.